The Sopranos finale isn't ambiguous. That's the polite version people tell themselves so they can stop thinking about it. The real ending is uglier, and it's hiding in plain sight. It's a handoff. Because Tony doesn't need to die for the story to win. He just needs to multiply. Watch what happens to the people closest to him, because that's where the damage goes when it can't go anywhere else. AJ doesn't grow up. He gets placed. He learns the family skill set. Perform a crisis, get rewarded, and call it a fresh start. Meadow doesn't escape either. She upgrades the same machinery into a respectable suit, turning Tony's world into something you can bill by the hour. And Carmela? The marriage was never a love story. It was a compensation package with a moral clause everyone agreed to ignore. So if the question is whether Tony gets punished in the end, that's almost adorable. The warning is different. The system survives him. The family survives him. And the worst part is that his legacy isn't blood, it's behavior. The ending isn't a mystery, it's a replication event. Who becomes Tony next? The tragedy of the Soprano household is not that a mob boss destroys his enemies. That part is practically an occupational requirement. The real spectacle is watching a man so committed to self-justification that he manages to reproduce himself and his children, with the same grim efficiency he applies to rackets and cover stories. The line about watching an angel fall lands because it describes the family's arc with irritating precision. Whatever innocence existed at the edges gets dragged, slowly and then all at once, into the gravitational pull of Tony Soprano's appetites. The therapist's warning to Carmela, leave, take what remains of the children while there is still something to take, functions less as advice and more as a diagnosis. By the end, what remains has been thoroughly processed. A J is the most obvious case study, because the series ultimately treats him like a mirror held up to Tony, only with a weaker frame and fewer coping skills. The finale hammers the point visually. A J descending the stairs in a bathrobe, echoing the show's repeated imagery of Tony doing the same, is not subtle symbolism. It is a family brand logo. The boy is made the way Tony was made. By proximity, by normalization, by a household that calls violence business and calls consequences persecution. The grim humor is that the transformation does not require aptitude. It requires surrender. The popular temptation is to flatten a J into one of two caricatures. Either a budding little gangster gleefully participating in violence and then crying about his feelings, or a fragile bystander who is simply harmed by forces beyond his control. The truth, unhelpfully for anyone trying to make the morality neat, is both. AJ flirts with cruelty in the way bored, insulated children flirt with danger, thrilled when a car bursts into flames, then abruptly reinventing himself as a future soldier, as though the military were a scenic route to purpose rather than another mechanism of violence. At the same time, the series makes plain that the gangster world does not merely entertain him, it corrodes him. The depression is not performative. The collapse is not imaginary. The near suicide is not a hobby. Whatever thrill exists is inseparable from the sickness that follows, because the household teaches him to chase spectacle and then to hate himself for needing it. Even the specific mechanics of his awakening carry the family's signature. Manipulation dressed as sincerity. The idea that AJ's sudden interest in the army is a convenient lever to pry open parental guilt is not far-fetched. It fits the Sopranos' domestic economy perfectly. The household runs on bargaining, not boundaries. Parents purchase relief from anxiety the way they purchase status, quickly, expensively, and with no long-term plan. So the boys pivot, ruined car, strategic talk of enlistment, reward in the form of a new vehicle and a neatly packaged job, reads like less of a personal breakthrough and more of an inherited technique. Janice does it louder. AJ does it softer. The result is the same. A family that teaches emotional blackmail should not be stunned when the children become fluent. Then comes the finale's final insult. The solution offered to AJ is not growth, but placement. He ends up orbiting the children of other gangsters, settling into the comfortable nepotism of a social circle built on shared denial. In the last family meal, framed like a last supper for a household that treats moral accounting as someone else's religion, AJ is no longer posturing as an environmental idealist. He is positioned as a budding producer for an entertainment operation with mobbed-up connections and a porn specialty, chauffeured by parental money, collecting his underage girlfriend from high school in a fuel-hungry sports car his parents effectively bought to quiet their own dread. Nothing says "we care" like turning a child's existential crisis into a lease agreement. Meadow's trajectory is more polished, which is the point. The show does not pretend she becomes her father in the same style. It insists she becomes him in the same logic. She is the family's intelligence dressed up as aspiration. The daughter who could have been a doctor, who could have used her discipline for a genuinely useful vocation, who represented the last respectable fantasy Tony allowed himself about fatherhood. The tragedy is not that she abandons medicine. People change careers. The tragedy is the reason and the replacement. She tells Tony, plainly, that watching federal agents drag him out of the house again and again helped make her decision. The effect is both sympathetic and damning. She does not reject his world. She adapts to it. She pivots into white-collar defense, corporate law, the respectable wing of the same ecosystem, polished, credentialed, and expertly designed to help powerful men continue behaving like Tony without the inconvenience of shame. That adaptation has been rehearsed for years. Meadow spends the series internalizing excuses for organized crime with the kind of scholarly enthusiasm most people reserve for literature. The poverty of the Mezzogiorno becomes a lecture, an intellectual costume that turns brutality into sociology. Demanding warrants when Tony gets arrested is framed as principled civil libertarianism, rather than what it often is in her orbit, reflexive protection of dad. Complaining that law enforcement humiliates him with shows of force continues the same pattern. Lawbreaking recast as victimhood, consequences reframed as cruelty. The series does not mock her intelligence. It mocks what she uses it for. Meadow's mind becomes a legal brief in constant search of exculpatory language. Naturally, the romantic resolution completes the circle. She settles down with the child of another mobster, a partner trained in the same rationalizations, the same inherited scripts, the same selective outrage. It is not love conquering adversity. It is tribal continuity. Carmela's fear, Tony ruins everybody, was never a metaphor. It was a forecast. This generational corrosion pairs neatly with one of the show's quieter debates: how Tony became so financially successful compared to his father. The question nags because Tony's own narration is a masterpiece of grievance. He reminisces about having 2 nickels and frames the big suburban house as the pinnacle dream of people who knew actual deprivation. Yet the surrounding facts resist the melodrama. The Sopranos were not destitute peasants crawling toward prosperity. Carmela's father was a contractor, which is the suburban version of a cheat code. Tony's household, by any reasonable measure, started as at least middle class. Less flashy, perhaps, but far from desperate. The complaint about being poor, delivered from a porch attached to a property that screams upward mobility achieved, plays like a familiar genre. Wealthy people performing scarcity as a way to feel morally entitled to more. The more plausible explanation is not romantic hardship, but inherited infrastructure. Johnny Boy left Tony interests, stores, businesses, arrangements that provided a platform. The pork store, the chicken place, sanitation connections, Barone-style links, bookmaking and loan sharking lanes. Even if the exact inventory is hazy, the point is not. Tony began on third base and spent decades claiming he built the stadium. Junior and Johnny had to acquire assets slowly and quietly, shaped by an older generation's preference for staying in the neighborhood and not turning wealth into a billboard. Tony comes of age in a post-Gotti world, where flaunting becomes a form of ego, and ego becomes a form of strategy. He also rises young, captain earlier than most, which means paying less tribute on the way up and keeping more of the take. At a house built with favorable family labor and likely discounted materials, no one with Tony's connections is paying full market rates for anything, including legitimate appliances. and the myth of poverty starts to look less like memory and more like branding. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that Tony is, in certain lanes, competent. He understands how to make money and how to make money grow. He cultivates legitimate ties, satriales, sanitation, union leverage, and various storefronts that blur the line between business and front. He participates in white-collar scams, including healthcare or HMO-style schemes, and benefits from larger developments like the Esplanade and HUD-related plays that bring serious revenue. Of course, those same plays bring serious attention, because greed rarely travels alone. Tony's wealth is both an achievement and an accelerant. It funds his life while drawing heat to his doorstep. And then there is the part Tony never narrates honestly. He lives above his means because excess is his chosen anesthetic. Gambling, in particular, is a sinkhole that can swallow any pocket once it becomes compulsion. The series lets him earn, and then lets him leak. In sum, Tony inherits opportunities, exploits them early, expands them aggressively, and then spends like a man terrified of silence. The first speech he gives to Melfi, that self-pitying anthem of being born into the wrong era, is not merely therapy chatter. It is the business plan and the excuse note rolled into one. The father's alleged modesty, meanwhile, is easy to overstate. Johnny Boy drove a 1956 Cadillac Eldorado Biarritz, hardly the vehicle of a man committed to anonymity. The old generation may have preferred the neighborhood to the spotlight, but they still enjoyed the perks. Johnny also left Livia a financial package large enough to alter lives. The myth of chronic scarcity sits awkwardly beside the reality of expensive tastes. Even the family's burdens have a transactional edge. Tony did not have to foot the bill for Uncle Eckley, an obligation that, if it existed in the ledger, would have been a non-trivial drain. When people romanticize Tony's climb as sheer hustle, they conveniently ignore the expenses he avoided, as well as the assets he inherited. Wealth in this universe is never just money. It is the material evidence of moral compromise. The comedic fantasy of a channel dedicated to breaking down fictional character finances, Tony alongside Don Draper and Gus Fring, sounds amusing until it reveals something bleak. Audiences sense that these men's bank accounts are narrative devices. They measure the size of the lie each character is telling about himself. That lie extends into Tony's sexual life, which raises a question that is less scandalized than logistical. How does a man with that many affairs produce no visible trail of illegitimate children? In a story world where consequences are usually eager to collect, the absence registers as conspicuous. The gangster archetype practically expects secret heirs as part of the aesthetic. Yet Tony's track record, for all its promiscuity, remains oddly consequence-free on that specific front. Explanations range from the banal to the darkly humorous. Medical caution, careful avoidance, narrative restraint. A suggested storyline involving Gloria becoming pregnant with Tony's child reportedly existed at one stage and then vanished when the creative direction shifted. That unrealized possibility lingers because it would have forced the show to confront the most literal form of legacy. The same thought experiment extends to Irina. What happens when the disposable Gumar becomes permanently connected through a child? Would Tony push for an abortion? Would he outsource the problem to subordinates the way he outsources other messes? Would the family's ethics reveal themselves as pure convenience? The fact that the series never pulls that trigger is either a mercy or a missed opportunity, depending on how much suffering seems necessary to make the point. Carmela's endurance invites a parallel debate. Is her loyalty realistic? One view insists the marriage should have fractured into multiple divorces, collateral children, and public embarrassment. Another view, more consistent with the show's psychological realism, notes that Carmela is built for this bargain. She is not merely trapped, she participates. She accepts the benefits, sanctifies the arrangement with selective morality, and occasionally pretends outrage when the emotional cost becomes too loud to ignore. The marriage persists not because Tony is uniquely devoted, but because the ecosystem rewards everyone for staying in character. That ecosystem also explains a more tactical question. Why Tony and Richie cannibalize Davy Scatino's sporting goods store rather than becoming shareholders and laundering money through a thriving business. On paper, invest sounds smarter than strip mine. In practice, the mob's logic is not investor logic. It is predator logic. Partnerships require patience, oversight, and the inconvenience of treating a weak man like a partner rather than a resource. Davy is not an asset. He is a liability with a gambling addiction and a history of digging deeper holes when confronted with shallow ones. A man who cannot cash flow a small debt has no credible path to servicing a large one at mafia interest rates, and any prolonged entanglement invites surprises: additional creditors, legitimate casinos, different families, legal exposure. Better to get in, extract value, and leave a husk. There's also a practical ownership issue. The store is tied to Davy's wife, meaning Davy likely cannot simply sign away equity. So Tony and Richie do what they do best: exploit access through Davy to cannibalize the business while staying just far enough away from formal ownership to maintain plausible deniability. Beyond that, the store's operating profile is wrong for their needs. A suburban sporting goods business selling big-ticket items that often move via credit cards is far more conspicuous than cash-heavy, low-visibility enterprises like a pork store, a strip club, or a shabby storefront where numbers can be massaged without setting off alarms. Those smaller, seedier operations also offer adjacent advantages: meeting space, social control, recruitment channels, even disposal logistics, that a brightly lit retail store cannot. Laundering is not merely about money movement. It is about camouflage. Camouflage, of course, is Tony's entire adult personality. Which brings the analysis back to the question of his inner life. Why does he seem to care more about animals than people? He grieves Cosette the poodle's death with a sincerity that often eludes him when humans die. He escalates to lethal outrage over a horse. The easy answer is that many people prefer animals to humans because animals do not lie, cheat, betray, or moralize. The less flattering answer is that this preference can reveal a weakness. Animals do not hold anyone accountable. It is effortless to love beings that cannot confront hypocrisy in language. Animals cannot demand ethical consistency. They cannot ask hard questions. They cannot insist on change. They accept food and shelter and offer uncomplicated attachment in return. For a man whose human relationships are defined by manipulation, domination, and resentment, animals provide the fantasy of loyalty without negotiation. The counterpoint is equally obvious. In real emergencies, a vehicle full of dogs will not arrive as paramedics. Cats will not form rescue parties. Wildlife will not risk itself to save a lost stranger. Humans do those things, imperfectly, sometimes reluctantly, but often. The romantic claim that animals are morally superior is more sentiment than truth. It can also be a convenient way to avoid the discomfort of human complexity. The series toys with this tension by letting Tony's tenderness toward animals expose a lingering capacity for attachment, while also highlighting his preference for relationships where he remains unquestionably dominant. That lingering capacity is at the heart of the recurring psychiatric label people try to pin on him. Is Tony a psychopath? A sociopath? Something else? The terminology matters less than the show's insistence on spectrum. Tony is not an empathy void. He shows real emotion in certain contexts. The scene with Junior near the end, the softening after AJ's suicide attempt, the protective fury when Meadow is threatened, the ache in the "don't you love me" moment when his uncle's deterioration strips away the last illusion of familial reciprocity. These are not the reactions of a man incapable of feeling. They are the reactions of a man whose feelings are selective and whose ethics are optional. Even the series' framing suggests that psychopath as a casual label is too tidy. The distinctions people reach for, psychopaths cannot feel empathy, sociopaths can feel it but inconsistently, attempt to map clinical language onto a character written to resist simplification. Tony's empathy is real, but it is tribal and self-serving. His grief appears when it reflects his own pain or threatens his self-image. His guilt arrives in dreams, because in waking life, guilt interferes with appetite. Those dreams matter. They expose what Tony refuses to say. He misses Carmela when she is gone. He fears judgment. He carries residue from the damage he causes. Dream logic turns personal history into symbolic theater. The ducks as family, the horse as displaced innocence, Tracy as a twisted echo of Meadow, the maternal wound as an ongoing infection. The show's most pointed insight is that Tony's sentimentality does not redeem him. It complicates him. He can feel and still destroy. He can cry and still order harm. He can love and still treat love as property. The maternal wound specifically explains both his stunted affection and his perpetual rage. Livia's coldness and weaponized misery carve him down to a nub, leaving him hungry for comfort and incapable of offering it cleanly. He learns early that love comes with hooks, that affection must be negotiated, that vulnerability invites punishment. So adult Tony becomes a man who buys devotion, threatens dissent, and confuses control with care. He does not lack feeling. He lacks the discipline to let feeling govern behavior when it conflicts with desire. This is why the question, did Tony even love his wife and kids, remains so productive. The evidence says yes, he does, in his way, and the qualifier is the indictment. He loves them like he loves everything, possessively, inconsistently, and with the expectation that the world will accommodate his moods. He rescues AJ from the pool and murmurs tenderness, and later he can still tell a therapist he hates his son. He worries about AJ's future, tries military school as a desperate intervention, and then fails to change any of the conditions that are crushing the boy. He wants Meadow safe and successful, and yet his life ensures her success is built inside a moral compromise. The family is both his pride and his hostage situation. All of this circles back to the show's bleakest observation. Tony's lifestyle is a power fantasy that sells well because it looks clean from the outside. He can take what he wants, strike who he wants, demand respect on command, and live as the boss of his own little kingdom. It is the kind of dominance people imagine when they are tired of being polite. The series' quiet cruelty is that it shows the cost behind the facade. The loneliness, the chronic misery, the compulsive consumption, food, sex, money, attention, used to fill a void that cannot be filled because it is not an appetite problem. It is a character problem. And so the angel falls, not in a single dramatic plunge, but in a slow drift into inherited habits. AJ becomes a softer version of Tony, learning that manipulation beats sincerity in a household that rewards performance. Meadow becomes a smarter version, learning that the cleanest crimes are the ones committed in conference rooms. Carmela becomes the accountant of denial, cashing checks and calling it sacrifice. Tony becomes the family's original sin with a charismatic smile, insisting he is a victim of circumstance while actively manufacturing the circumstances that victimize everyone around him. The miracle is not that the children turn into him. The miracle would have been if they had not. Ownership is exposure. Extraction is safety. Subscribe.